Welcome everybody to today's edition of the Halmstad Colloquium. The Halmstad Colloquium is a distinguished speaker series organized by two centers at Halmstad, Ceres and Kaiser. Both centers are funded by the Swedish KK Foundation, the Swedish Knowledge Foundation. It's a real pleasure to introduce Magnus today. Magnus is the Schlumberger Professor of Electrical Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology, otherwise known as Georgia Tech. Magnus has been there since 2001, and before that he did his PhD here in Sweden at KTH in applied mathematics. And before that he did his master's degree in engineering physics. And interestingly, before that, he does his bachelor's degree in philosophy. So very diverse background, and is reflected in the fascinating and diverse areas that Magnus has contributed to. Magnus's interests are in control of, hybrid and networked control of robotic systems, in particular mobile robotic systems. He has received several prestigious awards during his career, including the US National Science Foundation Career Award. More recently, he has participated in the DARPA challenge for cars for driving, autonomous driving. It's hard to say, to give due credit to all of his contributions, but I'm really very excited to have him here today, and so please welcome with me Magnus. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Walid, for that entirely undeserved introduction. I am delighted and honored to be here. I've heard quite a bit about Halmstad from Walid, and I've had two very good days here where I've actually met a lot of interesting people and heard about a lot of interesting research projects. What I'm going to talk about today is really multi-agent robotics, and in particular it's the problem of, let's say that we have a large collection of mobile robots, and each of the robots are not all that talented. They have limited information about what's going on in the world around them. They may have limited communication ranges, so basically they're nearsighted. They don't know everything that's going on, and together they need to collaboratively solve some global problem. Like, all of you need to go form a perfect circle in this room without knowing where most of the agents are. So this is the multi-agent robotic problem, and the reason why this is fascinating is when the robots move around, they get new neighbors, they see new robots. So what's happening is that you're building this kind of network structure where edges between nodes in the network come and go as the robots move around. So you get what's called a complex network, where you have not only the node dynamics, which is where the robots go, but the network itself evolves, which is because edges come and go. So I'm in general quite interested in networks in any kind of form. It can be power grids, it could be social networks, it could be biological networks. Today I'm going to talk about robot networks. And what I'm going to do is first I'm going to talk about what we as a community, a multi-agent robotics community, are pretty good at. So things like getting robots to form shapes or getting into formations is something that we kind of understand now. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what is it that we can do in terms of building geometric shapes with lots of robots. But then, let's say that I want you to go into a circle. So I've done that and I know how to do this. But now I would like you to form a figure eight. How do I interact with all of you in an effective way? Because it's completely the wrong idea to start moving you individually. And this is known as the human swarm interaction problem, where the question is, how do you actually interact effectively with large numbers of mobile robots in general, or mobile agents in particular? So I'm going to talk about this, and we have some initial results. This is a field that's kind of emerging. And it's not so much a matter of what are the correct user interfaces. It's a question of how should I think about you as a group? Should I think about the center of gravity and move that around? Should I think of you as particles in a fluid and kind of stir the fluid? It's not clear what the right abstractions are. So we'll be talking about abstractions quite a bit in terms of how should you as a user think about swarms or teams of mobile robots. I want to start though by showing the following video. I went to this conference called ICRA in 2009. This is the main robotics conference. And I gave this presentation. At the end, I had a video with 6 robots. And I was kind of proud of that video because, you know, there was some pretty math underneath the hood. And then the robots did something. And then after my talk, Arkelio Martinoli from EPFL in Switzerland showed up. And he showed this video. It's 278 robots. And at this point in time, this was 4 years ago, no one had done anything with over 25 robots. And these robots, they're all myopic in the sense that they only see their neighbors. They don't talk to each other at all, so there's no communication whatsoever. They don't have any global positioning, meaning they don't know where they are. And even weirder than that, they're not told in advance what role they should take in the final formation. And it's absolutely unreal how good this is. Look at this. Bam, 278 robots. This seems to be a commercial for another university. But I was sweating in the audience, because basically I shouldn't have a job anymore. Arkelio had solved all the hard problems. And actually, let's recap here. So there's no localization, meaning they don't know where they are. There are no pre-assigned roles, meaning no one has been told where to go in advance. They're not talking with each other at all. And they're only looking at, they have these sensor range skirts, so in this case infrared sensors around them, so they're measuring where neighbors are close to them. And basically, Arkelio solved every problem we'll ever be interested in multi-agent robotics, I thought. And then it turned out that there was a tiny little catch. So has anyone seen this video before? No. Okay, so here's the catch. By the way, this is all true. Arkelio did all of this, but what he did was he took 278 graduate students. They all placed a robot perfectly, and then he had the robots do random stuff. And then he ran the video backwards. So this was backwards in time. But I love this video because, well, I love it for a number of reasons. The first reason I love it is because it means that people like me, we still have a job, right? Because we can't, which is good. We can't do this forward in time yet. But I also really, really like it because this shows what we want to do as a field. So we want to actually be able to reverse time and actually do this forward in time. So ultimately, this is what all of us are striving towards, to actually do the EPFL demo but forward in time. The third thing I like about it is, even if the robots were doing random stuff, to get 278 robots to do anything is really, really, really hard. Because things always happen when you deploy large collections of robots. I typically never go beyond 20, and it's very unlikely that 20 robots function properly at the same time. So I can only imagine how difficult this was to even pull off. So let's keep this in mind as the mood picture in terms of where we're actually aiming with this talk. So I'm going to sit here in this talk. I'm going to be looking at multi-agent robots. And mainly I'm going to be interested in geometric type of problems where the robots have to form a shape or cover an area or maybe cover a perimeter or maybe sweep an area or follow a field. There are different geometrically defined objectives one can look at. But there are a number of application domains where the same type of problems show up. So in sensor networks, you typically want to deploy the mobile sensor network so that an area is covered. That's a geometric problem. Communication nets, what you want to do is you want to build a connected communication structure so that the person that wants to talk to the base station has connectivity for all time, even though he or she is moving around. Biological networks, it's all about the geometry of the protein folding, for instance, so what genes are where. I mean, this is also, you can express a lot of the problems in biology geometrically. So even though we're going to sit here in multi-agent robotics, you should keep in mind that a lot of the results actually, they transition into other application domains. So the first thing to keep in mind is what James Maxwell, or possibly Lewis Pauling, said, that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. And this is absolutely true when you go large scale. So if you have hundreds of robots, if the theory isn't done right, it's just not going to work. Because one robot or two robots, you're hacking something together, it's not going to be horrible. But if you scale this up and the theory isn't right, you're doomed. So we are going to have to do some theory. So I mean, I really liked James Maxwell, but I thought this was fantastic when I lived in Sweden. And then I moved to the US. And I discovered a great North American thinker named Yogi Berra. And Yogi Berra is a baseball player who supposedly said, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And this is really profound. Because that's the other thing that we're going to have to keep in mind. When you start deploying lots of robots, things will happen. The robots would start interfering with each other. If they start talking to each other, you're going to saturate the bandwidth very, very quickly. Because you have 1,000 robots, they're all talking, all of a sudden you get gibberish. The sensors, they're going to be these things called crosstalk, where my IR sensor is going to be picked up with you, and all of a sudden we don't know who is where. So things happen when you go large scale that you really can't do pen and paper or in simulation. You actually have to do it. So we need to do both here. We need to prove theorems, and we need to actually deploy it on robots. And there's no way around it when you go multi-agent. So, having said that, let's start with the things that we know how to do fairly well. And I want to start with what can arguably be thought of as the most canonical of all multi-agent robotics problems. It's known as the Rendezvous Problem. And it was proposed by this Japanese roboticist, Suzuki, in 1909. And the problem is as follows. I can only see where Adam is relative to me. So I don't know where I am, Halmstad or Stockholm or Atlanta, I don't know. I don't know where you are, but I know where you are relative to me. So this is me, this is Adam, and I can measure this vector. This is my position, by the way, that's Adam's position. So I know where Adam is relative to me. And I can do that with people that are close enough to me. And we can all do this. So you can all see where your neighbors are relative to each other. And the job now is, or the task is for us all to meet at the same location. That's the rendezvous problem. So we all somehow have to meet, all of us, at the same location. And the question is, how do we do that? So let's say that me and Adam are supposed to meet. I know you're there, right? Which direction should I go in? Towards you. It seems silly not to do that, right? So let's add Walid. So now I have two neighbors. Which direction should I go in? Middle somehow, right? Let's say I have more. Where should I go? Well, here's an idea, right? So this is me. Here are my neighbors. Let's aim towards the center of gravity of my neighbors. Why not? That seems entirely plausible. If I write this down, then my velocity, so this is my how I'm moving, well, I can actually sum up over all my neighbors and just these relative displacements. This equation actually encodes this fact that I'm aiming towards the center of gravity of my neighbors. And we're all going to have different neighbors because we see different things. And this equation actually provides the foundation of what's called swarm theory today. It actually has a name. It's known as the consensus equation, or the consensus protocol, because what it does is that it solves the rendezvous problem in the sense that we're all going to end up on the same location. Or in general, we agree on where to meet. If we were, if we all wanted to know what time it was and our clocks were slightly off, if I computed the center of gravity of all my neighbors' clocks, and we all did this, then we're going to agree on what time it is. If we're temperature sensors, we would agree on what the temperature is. So this is a general protocol that will allow us to agree on something in a distributed way, and that's important. And the only thing that's required is that the interaction topology, meaning the network, is rich enough. So if we're all blindly not looking at anyone, then clearly we're not going to agree on anything. So what we typically need is if we're building a graph, then this graph has to be connected, which means there needs to be a path through the graph between any two people or two nodes. As long as the graph is connected, this will actually work. And the graph can switch. You can change and remove edges. So as long as the graph stays connected, you're actually going to converge to what's called an agreement state, where we're all agreeing on whatever we want. And I wish I had proved this, but it's actually not. There are lots of people who have actually arguing a little bit about who was first, but it wasn't me. I wish it was me, but it wasn't. The thing, though, is if I have my robots, having them all meet in the same location is not all that useful, because that basically means a collision, right? So, but what you can do is you can start agreeing on other things, like, let's say, we want to form a circle. I don't know where I am, so it's pointless to specify where the circle should be, but what we can do is we can actually agree on where the circle should be by using the same kind of argument, but now instead of having x be the position, it's where I think the circle should be. And in fact, I'm going to show a video that's now 2 years old. This was a former student of mine, Ted McDonald, who now works for a company that builds multi-robot warehouses. And what these robots are doing is that they are now agreeing on where the particular shape they're told to form should be, how it should be rotated, and actually what role they should take on in the formation. And the cool thing here is that the robots are spelling grits which stands for the Georgia Robotics and Intelligent Systems Lab. And the reason why I insisted on this being a sequence of letters was that it would be equally hard to do forward in time and backwards in time. So there's no cheating going on there. So, or even if it's cheating, it's pointless because it's equally hard. And the nice thing is that this is getting close to the Swiss video we saw. It's not 278, there are 15 robots, but at least it looks something like what one would like these robots to be doing. And it's only the consensus equation, this equation we wrote down, but you're agreeing on slightly different things. And Ted here is messing with the formation just to see that this is indeed not pre-programmed and somewhat adaptive at least. I think it looks kind of good. Wow. This is 200,000 hits on YouTube, this video, by the way. All right, cool. So, how did we do this? Well, the main function here is that the consensus part, which was so x dot I is negative the sum, and then this term, this is present all the time. And the most standard way to mess with this equation is to add a scalar weight that's a function of the distance between agents. And in fact, let's say that, so what's your name? Veronica. Veronica. Let's say that me and Veronica, we're aiming towards each other, but a collision is imminent, so now I should start moving away from you. That means somehow I should flip the sign on my derivative. Well, I can add a weight that's positive when I'm far away and negative when I get too close. Well, now I avoid a collision. In fact, we can do other things. We can do things like coverage control. So there is a famous algorithm. It's really what's called Lloyd's algorithm, but Francesco Bullo made it distributed and beautiful for agents covering an area. In this case, there are various densities, and they need to cover this area in an equitable way. It's a weighted consensus equation. So you can do things like this by just being creative with the weights. And in fact, in the 1980s, early 1980s, Craig Reynolds, he was an animator for Disney, and he was asked to work on this movie they were thinking about called The Lion King. And what Craig Reynolds was asked to do was to animate 1,000 wildebeests, basically buffaloes, stampeding across the savannah. And Craig Reynolds, who was lazy and smart, figured out that, you know, I'm not going to write down what every little buffalo should be doing. Instead, yeah, buffaloes should probably stay together. If they're too far away, they should move towards each other. Positive weight. If you get too close, well, let's move away. So let's have a negative weight when you get close. And also, if we're heading in different directions, we should probably head in roughly the same direction. So that's consensus on the direction in which we should move. And then let's add a little bit of noise to make it look natural. So Craig Reynolds came up with this model, which is known as Reynolds Boyd's model, which is really just a weighted consensus equation. So this is what it would look like. Here's the lion, Simba, looking concerned because, oh no, here comes weighted consensus equations. But it's cool, right? This is just this piece of math that we just saw for generating these buffaloes. And then, you know, you put a little bit of graphics on top of it to make it look better. So that's exciting. You can do a lot of things. And the nice thing is that you can be fairly systematic in how you select your weights. So let's say that this is me, and this is, speak on Adam again. Well, I can actually define a scalar energy on our weight, or on our edge. So I associate an energy value with the edge. And then I sum up all these energies across the entire network. So now I get what's called an edge tension energy. And what I can do is I can start manipulating this energy. For instance, I could say that if I want to maintain connectivity, which means that if I'm close to breaking a connection, well, I should have lots of energy, which would be costly to break connections. Right? Or if I want to have formation control, again, I want to be a certain distance away from Veronica, then, you know, let's have the energy achieve a minimum at this desired distance. You can actually shape the energy in various forms to achieve certain objectives. And what you can do is, if you take the derivative, the partial derivative of the energy along an edge with respect to xi, you get something that's a scalar term as a function of the distance times this term, this linear term that we've already seen. Moreover, if I run a gradient descent, which is a way of sucking out the energy out of the network, so x dot I is just negative of this gradient, then it turns out to be exactly the weighted consensus equation. So if you just run a gradient descent over this energy, you get the weighted consensus equation. And the reason this is cool is the total derivative of the energy with respect to time, meaning how the energy changes over time, is this thing. And this is, you know, minus a norm square. So this is certainly non-positive. Most of the time it's going to be negative. So the moral of the story is that you're removing energy from the system as you move, which means that you're going to achieve this minimum, so hopefully. And in control theoretic terms, the energy is what's known as, you use Lassalle's invariance principle on the energy to prove that you actually end up with the kind of structures you want. So the nice thing is that geometrically we can do a lot of things. Now, not every energy function is going to work because you're going to get stuck in weird local minima, but in principle, you can do energy shaping on the edges and get these distributed controllers almost for free. So, having said that, let's pretend now that we're really, really good at controlling these systems. So let's say you're all sensor nodes, right? And I sent you out and I made you sit in this auditorium, and then I realized that, oh no, I would like everyone who's left-handed to be on this side of the auditorium and everyone who's right-handed to be over there. So what I could do is I could go and ask you now individually, are you left-handed or right-handed, and then move you nicely around. Or maybe there's some other way. I can kind of push you in some effective way to do this. Or even worse, you're sensor nodes, and I just deployed you at Halmstad University, and it turns out you're supposed to be at Chalmers, right? So how do I get you as a group to go over to Gothenburg? It's not entirely clear, and energy shaping is not going to help us. It's going to help us to get in some initial configuration, but how do I actually take control of you viewed as a multi-agent network? So the first thing I did when I started thinking about this, because I had this problem, is I went to biology. And the reason for it is we've learned a lot about distributed robotic systems from biology. There is a biologist at Princeton, Ian Cousin, who is absolutely tremendous. He's written all these papers on fish dynamics and ant dynamics and bird dynamics, and a lot of the things we now take for granted in terms of how we build these controllers actually can be traced back to Ian Cousin. He's been extremely instrumental to how to do this. And in fact, people have studied monkeys. I've actually worked a lot with dolphin scientists trying to come up with distributed controllers that act like dolphins and lions, because lions are really cool. But question is, can we go to nature here and learn something about, you know what, I now have a joystick. How do I interact with these large collections of animals? And it turns out that there are very few controlled interactions in nature, in the sense that where someone is trying to manipulate another herd or a team. In fact, there are lots of interactions, but they look like this, which is not all that useful, in the sense that what you want to do is disrupt things. Like the lion wants to disrupt the herd of zebras. He doesn't want to, you know, make it do interesting geometric pirouettes and stuff. So biology seems to be almost a dead end in that there are very few useful metaphors except sheep herding. And in fact, I've actually written a paper with a Hungarian shepherd, because sheep herding is really, you know, you have a swarm of robots, and then, so this is me. Let's say that this is Walid, right? He's a special robot. And what I'm doing is I'm telling Walid how to move. And I'm dragging you around. Not by the neck, but somehow nicely. And the bad news is that that leaves you to be the sheep, right? But the idea is that the operator interacts with some special leader robots, and then the motion of the leader robot will propagate through the network. And this is known as the leader-follower paradigm in multi-agent robotics. And it turns out that you can do quite a lot of things with that. Let's say that I wanted all the left-handed people to be on the left and all the right-handed people to be on the right. I grab Walid and I start shaking him around, probably in a clever way, so that his motion will somehow make the rest of you separate elegantly into two different sub-herds. Well, let's see if that works. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to just do an experiment where this is Walid, and these are two of you. And here's the network topology, and Walid is doing something random. And the followers are running the consensus equation, in essence. And one thing that you're seeing here is that these followers, actually they're collapsing down on top of each other. And if you're a controls person like me, you realize that this is kind of interesting. If the followers started on top of each other, there's nothing what lead can do. There's nothing the leader can do to separate them. Nothing. This is a sticky state, and once you're there, you stay. That means that this system is uncontrollable or not completely controllable, because there is a subspace where the followers sit on top of each other that if you start on it, you can't escape it. Which means that I can't take this particular system and make the followers do whatever I want, because they're going to die down on top of each other and then they're going to stay there. So this is an uncontrollable or not a completely controllable system, which is kind of interesting, I think. So, what was this? This is me, or this is the leader, say. Here are two followers. If the followers start on top of each other, and robot 2 looks at the relative displacement between itself and the leader, robot 1 looks at the relative displacement. If they start on top of each other, this relative displacement is the same. And no matter what the red guy does, the relative displacement is going to stay the same. So this is not completely controllable, which means I can't make, the leader cannot make the blue follower agents do whatever we want them to do. Because if you start on top of each other, you stay on top of each other. Okay, let's look at this network. Let's do the same thought experiment here. Let's take the two robots, 1 and 2, put them on top of each other. Well, the relative displacement to the leader is going to be the same, and the relative displacement between them is going to be 0. Which means that if they start on top of each other, they're going to stay on top of each other. So this is also an obstruction to controllability. There are things that I cannot make this system do, because there is this sticky subspace where you go towards it, actually, and then you stay on it. Certainly if you start on it, you're never going to escape this subspace. So this is not a system that I can effectively control. All right, let's look at this. In fact, let's do the same thing. Let's put 1, 2, and 3 on top of each other, right? And then let's just drag the leader around. Well, let's drag the leader forward. Well, what's going to happen is 3 is going to separate from 2, because 2 is more immediately affected by the leader. So there is a tiny separation that's going to open up. Well, that means that 2 is going to be dragged by 3 in a way that 1 isn't. So 2 and 1 are actually going to separate also. This system, it turns out, you can actually, by moving the red node around, make the blue nodes do whatever you want them to do. This is what's known as a completely controllable system. And the key here is the introduction of this node that broke the symmetry. So it turns out that if you want to control networks, symmetry, which we haven't defined yet, is bad. Which is kind of surprising, because as engineers, we like to build symmetric networks. We like to engineer things symmetrically, which actually means that we have less control over them. And that's kind of interesting. So let's first of all figure out what symmetry means, and then be a little philosophical about what it means in terms of controlling these networks. So in order to understand symmetry, we need to do a little bit of graph theory. So I have a bunch of nodes, or robots. Let's partition them into cells. So some robots belong to some cells. But let's do it in a special way. It's called an equitable partition. What it means is that two robots can belong to the same cell if they have the same number of neighbors in adjacent cells. So this guy has 2 neighbors in pi 1. This has also 2 neighbors in pi 1. So they get to be in the same cell. That's known as an equitable partition. We're going to do one more thing and say, you know what? This guy has 2 neighbors in this cell, but no neighbors in its own cell. While this node here has 1 neighbor in its own cell. It doesn't matter what's happening inside cells. That's known as an external equitable partition. Point being is that we can do things like this. So if I have a network, in this case 5 agents, well, this network has 4 external equitable partitions. I'm going to do something very special. I'm going to draw circles around the leaders. In this case, there's only 1 leader. So leaders get to be in their own cells. And then I'm going to see which is the biggest, or the one with the fewest cells. That's known as the maximal leader invariant, blah, 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 blah. But the point now is that here's the leader. These 2 nodes are symmetric with respect to the leader. So these 2 nodes will asymptotically behave exactly the same. And this is a system I cannot control. And this is what symmetry actually means. It means that you have these kinds of cells where multiple nodes are in. And what's the punchline here? Well, from the leader's vantage point, nodes inside the same cell look the same. And what I mean by look the same, I really mean dynamically act the same, asymptotically. So after a while, you have no way of actually manipulating individually the values of the robots that share a cell. That's what this means. And mathematically speaking, if the robots are running the consensus equation and you add a control term, a U term, to some of them, so L sub I is 1 if you're a leader, 0 otherwise. If you have this system, then the thing you cannot control is given by the differences between robot values inside the same cell. And that's asymptotically stable, which means that the difference between values inside cells will actually collapse, which means the things inside cells will collapse down to 0, and there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing. No matter what you do to the leader. There is a corollary to that, blah, 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 blah. The point, though, is that there are extensions that have been made to this graph theoretic controllability notion, but they all share the same flavor, that symmetry equals bad. If you want to control something, and you guys, if I want to control you and you're symmetrically organized, that's bad. And in fact, there was a recent paper in Nature that empirically rediscovered this result, Barabasi and Slutin. And basically what they did was empirically look at a lot of different networks. They looked at the US East Coast power grid, they looked at certain gene regulatory networks, they looked at Facebook, and found that the power grid is very hard to control because it's somewhat symmetric, at least. We like to build somewhat symmetric things. Facebook, social networks, are much easier to control because they tend to grow in asymmetric ways. And it's a little philosophically strange, right, that this semi-anarchistic social network is actually easier to influence, which I think is rather fascinating. But anyway, the moral of the story is symmetry is bad if you want controllability, which is surprising because if I didn't want you to do whatever I wanted you to do, but instead I have a state and I want my state to propagate through the network, that's known as influence as opposed to control, then symmetry is good. And in fact, you should be, the leader should be on the interior of the network if you want to have lots of influence. But if you want to be controlling the network, the leader should be on the periphery of the network, which I also thought was, it's a little interesting that you get this kind of topological network organizational results out by looking at something like controllability. And one can ask, though, why in the world would anyone care about controllability? Because it's a very strong property. It means that if you were completely controllable by me moving Walid around, I can make you form any circle I want, anywhere I want. And not only that, I can make you go anywhere in the circle. So if you have a circle, I can do this to Walid, and then two people have changed position, for instance. It's a very strong property. But it is fundamental in that if the system is completely controllable, we know that we can do anything to it. If it's not completely controllable, we know that there are things we cannot do, no matter how much we try. So I like it from that fundamental reason. But there is a huge question of, you know what, this means that in theory, mathematically, I can write down what Walid should be doing, but that doesn't mean that me as an operator with a joystick know how to move Walid around. So I asked the question, does controllability actually matter if you have human operators interacting with these networks? Or is it just a cute mathematical construction? So what I did is I did a painstaking user study. I don't particularly enjoy doing user studies, but I did one where I had a bunch of different kinds of tasks. These tasks were all build certain geometric shapes, and I had a bunch of different networks. These are some examples. So this is a line with 7 nodes. This was called a cycle, a complete graph, a star graph. I had a bunch of different kinds of networks, and I picked different leaders on these networks, and then I basically just asked users in a simulation to drag this network around to build the shapes. And what we did is, here's a video of this, for instance. You want to form a wedge, and you're moving the leader around, and it's really quite hard. It's very frustrating, actually, to try to do this. You know, you get a wedge kind of here, but then it keeps moving, and yeah, it's just complicated. And I think one of the reasons it's so hard is because it's hard, but another is that as people, we never try to do this kind of interacting with lots of organisms. We organize militaries and universities and companies hierarchically so that you don't have to interact with 200,000 anything. You have 4, and then those 4 have 4. And hierarchies are much easier to interface with than these kind of networks, democratic networks of anything. So anyway, this looks pretty miserable. And what we did is we actually tried to quantify how miserable it was. So we looked at the performance error, meaning how far away you were from the shape in some least square sense. And then we had a completely subjective questionnaire where we asked the users to say, was this hard, was it easy, how easy was it, you know, some kind of ranking stuff. And then we even looked at workload, which measures how much you have to actually work. And we used the TLX measure that NASA has developed. And here's the result. Can you see it? How about now? Point is, I don't want you to look at this. Here is the punchline. The punchline is that the rank of the controllability Gramian, which is fancy speak for saying how controllable is it, negatively correlated to all these measures. But these measures are all bad, which meant controllability equals good from a user's point of view. That's what that meant. And also, things that, like node centrality, which means how central you are, positively correlated to it, which means what we already said. Central leader nodes equals bad. You should grab hold of things on the periphery, and the higher this rank of the controllability Gramian, which means the more controllable it is, the easier it actually is for human operators to interface with it. So this for us validated somewhat that controllability was not just a mathematically interesting notion, but actually a relevant notion to the human swarm interaction problem. Yeah?
Could you redefine what you meant by controllability?
So the question is, what do I actually mean by controllability? Technically, a system is controllable if you can go from any configuration to any other configuration. Or completely controllable, which means if you take all the states, map them in a giant state space and say, this is where you are right now, then I can go anywhere. Meaning, I can move my lead around in such a way that no matter where you start, I can make you into whatever shape I want. That's what controllability means. The rank of the controllability Gramian tells you how many dimensions you effectively have. So you remember that in the triangle case, the robots get sucked into this sticky subspace, which meant that you lost actually 1 dimension because along this subspace, you can't control it. So so the rank of the controllability Gramian is almost, you can think of it as degrees of freedom that you have control over. And if it's completely controllable, you have control over all the degrees of freedom. Good. Okay. But that's the punchline. Controllability matters. I think that's what I took away from this. But I think the real punchline of the user study was that people were really, including myself, bad at it. Right? So I put a little asterisk here because it really didn't seem like, even though controllability mattered, people were pretty miserable at it. And what I took away from it was really that this may actually not be the right way of thinking about these interactions if you have large-scale networks. So one thing that I've started to get very excited about is how do you actually interact with truly large collections of individuals? Well, then this leader-follower model is probably the wrong model. And people have looked at some other models. One is boundary control. So Miroslav Kristik at San Diego has looked at boundary control. We're basically pushing the boundaries of the swarm a little bit. It's a leader-follower model. It just happens to be that you pick a group of leaders on the boundary. What I want to end the talk is to talk about these flow-based interactions, where my idea is that no, I'm not going to worry about you individually, but you're going to be particles suspended in a liquid, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stir the liquid and in that way make you move around. So the question is, can we do something like that instead? Instead of fussing over individuals, just see, can I get some motion or some general shapes to emerge by thinking of you as points in a liquid? And in fact, I love this picture. Here's a North African boy with a stick, and this is a swarm of locusts. And it's clear that this boy is not trying to manipulate individual locusts. I'm going to guess that what he's doing is somehow stirring the locust, kind of trying to get some general motion going. So clearly individuals don't matter. He doesn't care whether or not he gets perfectly the right shape. He just wants to induce some general motion in this swarm. So this is now what we try to do in the swarm interaction problem, where you go truly large scale. Can we do something like what I think this boy instinctively is doing in a way that actually makes sense for users. So I'm calling this human swarm interaction, when swarm means truly large scale, and it's so many that individuals don't matter, and worrying about where individual agents go is clearly pointless. So let's see how we can do that. And to do that, let's start with a multi-robot network. I draw a lot of pictures like this. So here's a robot, and they can communicate if they're within range, and I'm going to draw an edge between them if they can communicate. A lot of times this is a lie. If you go outside or large scale, what's really happening is this. You have an infrastructure, so this would be routers, and the routers are talking to each other, and the robots are talking to the routers if they're within range. So let's start with this, and let's get rid of the robots. They're annoying. Well, they're lovely, but let's get rid of them for a bit. And just see what can we get if we focus in on the static infrastructure network. So this could be wireless routers, there could be air traffic control towers, there could be cellular base stations. So people are walking around talking to different base stations, but the base stations stay put. So let's look at the static infrastructure network for a bit. So here is a router, and these two routers are within range. I'm going to draw an edge there. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to form what's called a simplicial complex, which is fancy speak in this case for triangles around these nodes, and say that this router, just like the air traffic control towers, this router is in charge of all the robots that happen to be inside this triangle. So now I'm going to have robots, and since I'm inspired by air traffic, we're going to draw them like airplanes. But we have robots inside these triangles, and they're now going to move around in between triangles. Let's start with this setup. So then you can do one of two things. One is you can look at individual robots, which is what we've done up to this point, and write down some kind of dynamics for those robots. If you're a fluid dynamics person, this is what's called the Lagrangian view of fluid dynamics, where you describe the evolution of individual particles. And that's the standard model in multi-agent robotics. But if you keep reading this introductory fluid dynamics course, chapter 2 is called Eulerian fluid dynamics, where you say, let's not worry about individuals. Instead, let's worry about things like densities. And if you have a surface, how many are going through that surface? You don't care who it is, you don't track where they are, but you care about things like densities and flows. So for instance, you can have two in this triangle and one in that triangle, and then somehow some of them are going to move. One of them or two of them. Let's see what we can get if we go Eulerian instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to associate a state, P sub I, with each triangle. And this is going to be some kind of abstract state. And then I'm going to try to come up with some dynamics on P sub I that makes sense if I want to stir it or control it as a swarm. Okay, so here's my network. This is my infrastructure network. I am going to do the following, because we learned about the consensus equation. I'm going to say that this state that I don't know what it means, it's going to be this part, which is the consensus part. It's just there to keep the network coherent, so it stays together. And I'm going to add a control term, or what's called a forcing term. If I write this down, where I collect all the P sub i's and all the U sub i's, I can write this dynamics on what's called ensemble form, where P dot is negative LP plus U, where L is known as the graph Laplacian. And what it's doing is encoding this in this structure here. It really doesn't matter too much what it is, but one question one can ask is, what should this be? What is U? If I want to interface or interact with a swarm of robots, what should U be? Which is kind of a silly question because we haven't defined anything. But regardless of that, let's see if we can be a little clever about how to pick this forcing term. And the first thing we should note is there's another fancy matrix known as the incidence matrix. And this guy here, the Laplacian, can be written as DD transpose. Again, doesn't matter much. But the thing that matters is that when you have DD transpose, you have what's called a Gramian. I don't know if you've seen Gramians, but Gramians show up all the time. I walk around on campus here and I find Gramians, right? Why do I find Gramians? Jan, you're a mathematician. Why do I stumble over Gramians when I'm out walking? Because of least squares. So let me spend a minute talking about least squares, because I think this is wonderfully cool. So nothing to do with anything I've talked about so far. I just want to talk about least squares for a second. Let's say that I want to solve ax equal to b, and I want to solve this with respect to x. And a is long and skinny, which means I have too many equations, right? I can't solve this, but what I can do is do the next best thing, which is really just look at, well, I want to minimize with respect to x this thing. Okay, minimize means you take a derivative, right? So let's take the derivative. So if I take the derivative of this thing and divide by 2, then I get A transpose AX minus A transpose B. Okay, if I want to minimize something, I set the derivative equal to 0. So I do that, I get that A transpose AX has to be equal to A transpose B. This is known as the normal equations of the least squares problem. Every least squares problem has a set of normal equations. And, ta-da, here's the Gramian. This Gramian comes from this least squares problem. Okay, I have a Gramian. The Laplacian that I could write as d transpose. P is my mystery variable. Let's just plug it in there. And then I have A transpose B. Let's call it df. I have no idea what f is. But I'm just writing things down blindly, symbolically. And then I say, okay, what is the least squares problem? Well, it's this least squares problem. So this weird equation, I don't know what it is yet, somehow is the normal equation to this least squares problem. And one way of solving it, a optimization problem is to run a gradient descent. So if I run a gradient descent on this thing, I would get P dot is this thing, which is negative d transpose P plus df. And d transpose was our friend the Laplacian. So P dot is negative LP plus df. Right? This is what you get by doing nothing, except just saying this is a Gramian. But here's the cool thing. That's an input. That's my forcing term. This is what the U that we just wrote down has to be. It has to be. It can't be anything else. Fundamentally, this is what the forcing to the consensus equation needs to be. And this turns out to be key for controlling swarms, which is very surprising, but it does. Why is that? Well, let's do this equation. This is what the infrastructure nodes are going to do. This is their agreement protocol. And this thing solves this equation in the least square sense, because we just figured that out. Let's figure out what P and F are, because I just wrote down numbers or symbols here. F assigns a number to each edge. So let's say that it's an edge between me and Adam, and it says 9 on it. So that's what F does. P assigns a number to each vertex. So I'm 4 and you're 11. Right? The edge is 9. And D transpose, it's just computing differences across the edges. So 4 minus 11 is negative 7. So negative 7, and then we had the number on the edge, that's 9. Right? So that's all it's doing. It's trying to get this negative 11 to be close to 9. Or was it negative something? But the cool thing is that here is the real interpretation. This is a flow. This is a desired flow along this edge. That's why I call it F. P is pressure. Physical. It's just the pressure. And this is something like a gradient. Computes differences. So really what's going on is the following. I have my infrastructure network. And along comes the North African boy with a stick. And does that. What is he doing? Well, he's specifying a desired flow between simplices, or between triangles. So he would like lots of locus to go from this triangle to that triangle. A little bit of locus from there and a little bit from there. Right? But you're going to run out of robots really quickly if lots of them are going to go from this triangle to that triangle. So this is not possible to realize physically. So what you need to do is get as close to this as you can that actually preserves the amount of robots you have in the simplicial complex, which is this thing, the D transpose P, which is the resulting flow that gets as close as possible to what we want it to have in a least square sense. So this is what the resulting flow would look like. And this is computed in a completely distributed way by the routers. So the routers only talk to the neighbors and they compute the flow. Now, what you can do is you can plop down a robot there and then have the router tell that robot how to move in order to be consistent with the flow. That's called a stream function. And you can actually get things like this, where this is what the robots would look like. These are now particles suspended in this fluid with flows in between triangles, which is kind of satisfying. However, remember Yogi Berra? He said, you know, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. Let's see if we can actually do this for real. So, like I said, this is the picture to keep in mind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move around and use what's called a motion captioning wand. So I'm going to have a motion captioning system and move the wand around, which corresponds to the stick that the boy is holding. And then it's going to move across these boundaries between cells. And if you move quickly, you get a big arrow, a big flow. If you move it slowly, you get a little one. Right? That's all we're going to do. And then we're going to, in a distributed way, move the robots around. So let's look at that video here. So here's the world. turquoise means obstacles or boundaries, so the robots aren't allowed to move around it. And this is my former student, Peter Kingston, who was moving this around. And the thing to notice immediately is that this is trivial to do. He's just going to be moving, now he's going to go back and cancel out this flow, I think. Is that what's going on? He's just standing there. Peter. Right? So he's cancelling out the flow, he's inducing a new flow, and this feels very, very much like stirring a fluid. And I've had kids come to the lab and they love doing this because it's so easy. Now there is no failed user study where everyone was kind of horrible at it. So I'm really excited about it because it's intuitively clear what's going on and it corresponds to something that's rather easy to do. You know, it's inducing a big flow through the middle here and the robots are drawn around through it. There are a couple of caveats here. So the first caveat is, if this was the airspace, right, then you have no idea what plane is going where, which kind of matters when you're flying, right? So if individuals matter, this is wrong. The other thing is, I have this little triangle here, and I said there is a router in the middle of it. So I'm faking the routers, because there have to be routers there. In this case, the router is a computer program somewhere else that's pretending to be a router. And certainly there's not a collection of routers in this locus swarm anywhere. So that's a thing that I don't know how to get around yet. But that's clearly something to keep in mind. In fact, I want to end by just pointing out some of the questions. The first is this, let's call it the Eulerian approach. I really like this idea of stop worrying about individuals and looking at flows and manipulating flows. I think that's extremely natural, but I needed to inject this static infrastructure in there, which is not, it's clearly not what's happening in a locus swarm. Or it's not even what happened in my robot swarm. I had to fake routers. So is there some way of viewing flows without having to rely on a static infrastructure? I think that's really interesting. But the bigger question is, what are the correct interaction models? This is wide open, and I think it's extremely important because we're going more and more towards these complex networks that people have to interact with, and we need to understand, ultimately, how we should think about them from a user's point of view. And this is not a question of, you know, should the light flash green or blue, right? It's not a human factors problem. It's an abstraction problem in terms of how do we actually think about these systems. I've recently learned a term called affordances. So my human factors buddies, they tell me, for instance, that a doorknob supports the affordance of twisting or maybe pulling. So it's a mapping from object to activity. That's an affordance. So what are the affordances when you're dealing with swarms? Meaning, what are the things that you want the swarm to do, and how should you actually approach this? And I was talking to a grad student of mine saying, and I want the swarm to spread out. Maybe I want to be able to shape it or even split it into pieces. And I was doing what I'm doing right now with my hands, and he goes, oh, it looks like you're playing with Play-Doh, which is this toy for kids, which is clay. Modellera in Swedish, right? So what we did is, okay, fine. So we built a Play-Doh joystick now where you have a camera that's looking at the shape of the Play-Doh and then it's trying to have the robots move according to it. But I think this is an interesting question. What is the joystick? Should we have a joystick? Should we have Play-Doh? How do you actually map actions onto swarm actions, which I think is interesting. And then last, this is also, I think, a profound question, is what is the appropriate thing we want to do? Controllability is extremely strong. Is there a weaker influence notion that is appropriate when we're manipulating and deforming these swarms? And can this thing be made mathematically precise? Right now, no one really knows, but I think it's a wonderful, wide open question that it would be cool to know the answer to. So with that, I actually just want to say thank you and point out that if there's anything that you found good, it's entirely due to one of my many talented students here. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Magnus, for this wonderful talk. Questions from the audience? Tony?
You had some images showing this follow leader, and you didn't got what you wanted really.
Yep.
If you had let the leader be twice as fast as the followers, wouldn't you have got a better result?
I would. So the question is, if I made the leader, by the way, I've been told to repeat the questions for the purpose of recording. So the question is, if I made the leader more agile, twice as fast, for instance, can I get better results? And I think you can, but that wouldn't actually change anything in terms of the dimension of the controllability subspace. All it would do is you would be a little bit better at doing the things you can do, but the things you cannot do would still be out of your reach. And the other thing is, right now, in the way I set things up, the followers are attracted to the leader. The dogs in sheep herding are repelling the sheep. That also doesn't change anything. This flip-in sign doesn't change anything in terms of the dimension, but what it can do is it can render the system unstable, where you all of a sudden start pushing in different directions. One interesting question about that, though, is how many dogs, for instance, would you need to contain and move a herd of sheep or robotic sheep? Because now, if I'm pushing, you're just going to drift off. So I clearly need someone to push from the other side, but then maybe you split up in two. So now how many do I need to contain if you start reversing the sign? I think that's a really interesting question. It doesn't change the analysis, but it changes, I think, the feel of what you can actually do.
If you are allowed to switch the sign and communicate that you want to switch the sign, like a dog maybe can signal to the chicks something if you want them to repel or to track. If you have that wireless communication, would that influence the controllability?
So the question is, would the wireless communication, or again, communication abilities among the leader change controllability? And the answer is no, because controllability says this is the best you could possibly do. There exists a controller that would take you from here to there. You have no idea how to find it, but what it would do is it would make it easier to actually find a controller like that. And again, I think it would make the things we can do easier to do, but controllability is really what's known as it's a centralized open loop concept that says that there exists a controller. This controller may be completely centralized, meaning all the leaders are talking to each other, and they know everything about all the followers. But one exists. Now, does a distributed one exist? Does one with limited communication exist? Probably not, but I like it because it's the fundamental question, but that doesn't at all mean that you can actually implement it in any meaningful way, for instance, without communication. And I think what you're hinting at is really an important question, is if you start endowing the leaders with more and more capabilities, or better, what should they have, and how much more effective can you get as a function of this increased capability? Don't know the answer to it at all, but I mean, intuitively it feels like so it should be the case that you're better. I mean, clearly, me and Walid are going to be more effective at herding you if we can talk than if we cannot. But what should we talk about? Don't know. How much should we talk? Don't know. But it's a good question, and I have no good answers to it.
You were saying that in real life, leadership might have a hierarchy, and it becomes easier to control. So have you tried to have hierarchy in the leadership while controlling robots?
So I have. And so I think the story is valid in the sense that we tend to organize ourselves in a hierarchical way, and that means that we're, as a species, very rarely do we actually, unless we have really lots of kids, right? We very rarely try to control large, or if we're teaching large classes. So that, I think, is true. Now, have I tried it and didn't change my analysis? So the sad story or answer is yes, I tried it and it didn't change all that much, because now you have a tree structure in your network, for instance. Well, same symmetry questions still hold. It's just, how many neighbors you have. So hierarchies turns out not to be that effective for my robots under this setup. So the answer is I've tried it and it doesn't quite support the rest of my story, so I kept it quiet. So any more questions that are puncturing my bubble here?
Yeah, Sid?
I have two very simple questions. The first one is that what impact would it have if the leader switch? And the second one is that in the end, when you showed the Plato thing, did you try to actually map the hands instead of the Plato? Because that would be even more cooler than Moses.
So there are two questions. The first question is, what happens if you're allowed to switch the leader? And there you can get a lot of benefit. And this is known as the leader selection problem, where how do you pick a leader? The problem is that it's fairly easy to pick the best leader if I'm centralized and know everything. But the problem of a distributed leader selection problem is actually hard. There are lots of algorithms out there, but they're all kind of wishy-washy. It's a little bit of, you know, typically auction-based things where different nodes are bidding on the benefit or the privilege of being a leader. But it's clear that changing leaders is a good idea. It's not clear how to do it, let me put it that way. The second question is, why didn't I track the hands? It would be cooler. Well, I think it was pretty cool the way it was, but Play-Doh, you know, I did blue, which is very, very easy to do. I just did it because it seemed like a natural thing to do. But the more important story is, if I do this, I make it a U, then it's going to take me 2 minutes for the robots to get into a U. So this more dynamic, fluid thing I would get if I'm like conducting this in real time, it wouldn't matter because the robots wouldn't respond quick enough. So the time scale of what the robots are doing is still so much larger as compared to what I'm doing with the Play-Doh that I think, apart from the fact that it would be cool, I wouldn't benefit anything from it. The third point, though, is that I'm not a computer vision person at all, which means that I want to take the easiest off-the-shelf, here's a colored blob, what shape has it, algorithm, and just have it run, which you can do on shapes of Play-Doh, but tracking fingers that are moving is much harder. So those are three answers in one.
So I was a bit surprised by your answer to leader selection question, because from distributed algorithms point of view, leader selection is the same as consensus. And you solve consensus in your setting, apparently, but for leader selection you kind of dismissed it. Why do you do that?
Yeah. So that's a very, very valid point. So the point is, so leader selection is just consensus, and I can do consensus in a distributed way. Why don't I just do it on leader selection? The biggest problem there is you're selecting leaders to achieve certain things, like, in this case, let's say controllability, which is a global network level question. And it becomes hard to agree on network topology, even though it sounds like a straight consensus problem. That turns out to be difficult to agree on, because I can look around me and see, okay, here are my neighbors. Now what we need to do is somehow, if I am allowed to tell everyone who my neighbors are, and then they start keeping track of things, then you can build up everyone after a while, have a copy of the graph, and then you can easily do it. But this thing grows, and now it grows unbounded if the number of agents go off to infinity. The beauty of the consensus equation is, it doesn't matter how many agents you have, you just look at your neighbors, compute the average. So you can, if you allow for things that are dependent on the size of your network, but and it's actually, I'm not a leader selector, so I may be slightly misleading, but my understanding is part of the complication when you're doing things like this is that you need to understand the structure of the network, which means you need a representation of nodes and edges, which means that you need to know how many you are, and if the number of agents go off to infinity, you need an infinitely large brain to keep track of it. So if that's not the problem, I think what you're saying is absolutely correct.
Other questions? I have a related question. Okay. Is there an intuition, are there some good intuitions for what things would work for distributed consensus? Are there kind of simple rules of thumb that would tell us the amount of storage that's needed in a node, for example, is certainly one way to give a counter example. Yeah. Are there ways to say that something looks like it should be doable as a distributed consensus?
So there is a systematic way, and I wish there was. But for instance, this grits, the robots that were, so the question, by the way, is there an intuition and a systematic way of telling in advance whether or not an algorithm is naturally consensusable or not? That's right. And the answer is not to my knowledge. And again, when I spelled grits, deciding where the formation should be, how it should be oriented, is very easy consensus-wise. But deciding who goes where, which is known as the assignment problem, is not. Right, so who goes where, what we ended up with is a highly suboptimal solution where basically, here's a spot, I'm going for it, and if you seem to be getting there before, I go, okay, sorry, you got it, right? Which is clearly, that's a greedy algorithm, certainly not optimal in any way. It's conceivable that I have to walk all the way around. But it would be interesting if one could come up with, here are classes of problems that are easily consensible, and here are others that are not. I don't know the answer, but I like the question. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Joe?
Yes. In the beginning, you showed some pictures where you had, you said you had a couple of robots and they had no communication. They just had sensors to sense their neighborhoods. But isn't that also communication?
Yeah.
Especially if you mark the robots with some marking so that you can see what is left, what is right, what is its direction.
What's your name?
Tony Larsen.
Torgny. Tony, ursäkta. Sorry. So Tony, you're that's exactly right. I mean, this is one of the fundamental. You know, I can even do a little dance. The bees do this wiggle dance, right? And that I'm encoding information, so I'm actually communicating. And this distinction becomes a little strange and forced. I like to think of the distinction in the following way: that when I'm sensing, I know I'm truly only getting relative things, which is where are you relative to me? And when I'm communicating, there is some notion of being able to communicate states, meaning I could, if I knew where I am, tell you where I am. So I tend to separate it, at least in my mind, as are you getting relative information or absolute information? And that to me seems to be where the distinction should be drawn, and not really sensing and communication, because at the end of the day, I mean, if I tell you something, well, you're sensing it with your ear, right? So it's not clear. That distinction is a little pointless, except it makes sense in terms of I buy these things that I call sensors, and I buy this thing that I call the transmitter, right? And with the transmitter, I can tell you how old I am, but by looking at you and me, we can figure out roughly who is oldest, right? So that's where I draw the distinction, but you're absolutely right. There is no fundamental difference between sensing and it's all information exchange, right, at the end of the day.
Other questions? Well, I have one somewhat technical question.
Absolutely.
In the example where you had a triangular grid and things were flowing, and you had an F that consisted of 3 vectors on that graph, and then you completed them using the D.
Yeah.
What kinds of conditions do we need to be able to determine the unique, complete flow that we could use for the rest of the system? At an intuitive level,
right? So the condition. So first of all, you're actually not. So you're uniquely determining the resulting flow, and it's the globally optimal flow in the least square sense. But since the pressures themselves are not unique in that we can all add 10 to our pressures, and it's because it's the pressure differences that matter. So you're not getting unique pressures, but you're getting unique differences. If the graph is connected, that's all you need. In fact, it's if and only if the graph is connected. If it's disconnected, you're not getting it. But if it's disconnected, you are doomed anyway. Yeah. So the topological condition is very weak. You only need connectedness to indeed get a non-unique yet global minimizer. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah. One more question.
Are there any restrictions on the field in this case? What I mean is, could you make everything go to a point and so on?
Oh, you mean on F?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there are no restrictions. But if you try to, because what you're getting is you're computing these pressure differences, but you can end up with very, very strong spiraling vortices, for instance. So what we're doing now is we're looking at things like divergence-free versions of this, where you want to avoid spirals, right? But mathematically, there's no restriction. Physically, the robots will end up looking foolish if you don't do things like divergence-free flows instead of this completely free flow. There's also no reason why they need to be triangles. You know, any kind of simplicial complexes you're allowed to build as long as you define what you mean by an area.
Very cool. One more question.
So,
yeah.
Slightly from a more practical point of view, because I think that those flows look very nice. But what kind of domains do you imagine this to work? Like you said, for airplanes, it wouldn't. It seems like in most domains you actually care about the individuals.
So the question is, where do you actually care? When is it relevant or reasonable to assume that individuals don't matter? And for aircraft, clearly they matter. Right? So I am going to say that. So first of all, to the boy with the stick, it doesn't matter, but it's a picture I found on the internet. That's clearly not an application. No, but in sensor networks, in communication networks, you just want to have a sensor node out there to cover something, or you want a relay node to be able to build up a communication net. You don't care which node ends up where. Absolutely not. If you're doing things like you're scheduling the guards around Halmstad University who need to sweep the area every now and then, you really don't care. Well, maybe the guards care, but we don't care as consumers of security services in the form of guards, you know, which guard ended up going where. So I think there are lots of applications where you don't care. There are some where you, and lots where you do. And I am going to predict that as time goes on and we're seeing greater level of autonomy in various of these complex networks emerging, there are going to be more and more where we don't care about the nodes individually, because we're going to have, you know, nano robot flies providing the video recording of this lecture flying around in the hall 15 years from now. So there we don't care who it is, I think. So, but sometimes you do.
Well, on that note, we have a small gift for you, and we would like to very much thank you for this wonderful talk.
Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you very much, Magnus.